The dust hung thick and hard, a fine ochre powder that coated everything: my boots, my hair, the brim of my hat, even the back of my throat. It tasted like dried earth and old secrets. Another remote dig, another urgent call. This time, the location was a sun-baked plateau in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest paved road, where a team of archaeologists had unearthed something far beyond their usual pottery shards and flint tools. "Omar, thank goodness you're here." The lead archaeologist, a wiry woman whose face was etched with sun and worry, greeted me. Her name was irrelevant, her distress was palpable. "We thought it was just a burial pit at first. Then, this." She gestured vaguely towards a large, excavated area shimmering under a canvas awning. I nodded, my gaze already sweeping the scene. A cluster of tents, equipment glinting, and a distinct hush that wasn't just the heat. It was the hush of reverence, or perhaps dread. I pulled my field kit from the back of the SUV, the familiar weight a small comfort against the vastness of the landscape. "Tell me what you found." She led me to the edge of the pit, a gaping rectangle in the reddish soil. Below, a dozen or so figures, or what remained of them, lay intertwined. The smell was faint, an earthy mineral scent, not the cloying sweetness of fresh decay, but a deeper, more ancient kind of quietus. Initial assessment puts them at roughly 3,000 years old, the archaeologist explained, her voice hushed. Bronze Age, maybe early Iron Age. There are no grave goods, no discernible pattern, just bodies, lots of them, and the trauma. She trailed off, her eyes wide. "It looks like a massacre." I descended carefully, my boots finding purchase on the temporary wooden steps. The air in the pit was cooler, still, and heavy. My eyes, accustomed to dissecting death, immediately began their work. The archaeologists had done a commendable job of exposing the remains without disturbing them further, leaving the strata mostly intact. Each skeleton was a story, a history written in bone. They lay in contorted positions, limbs tangled, some stacked atop others. Skulls showed blunt force trauma, clean breaks, and depressed fractures. Rib cages were splayed, vertebrae disjointed. A brutal end, certainly. But as I moved closer, kneeling beside one particularly well-preserved individual, a male, my practiced eye caught something that made a tiny, almost imperceptible prickle crawl up my spine. The bone itself. The way it had fractured, the sharp, almost clinical edge of a break on a femur. It wasn't quite right for a blunt weapon from the Bronze Age. The edges were too clean, the angle too precise. And then there was the color. A subtle, almost imperceptible variation in the staining, a patch of something darker, less consistent with the surrounding soil. My internal alarm bells, usually reserved for the sterile confines of a lab, began a slow, deliberate toll. I pulled out my magnifying loupe, adjusting the lens. It was a faint, almost invisible residue. Under magnification, I could make out minute, almost metallic flecks embedded in the bone matrix near the fracture. Not rust from an ancient iron blade, which would have leached and stained differently over millennia. This was something else. Something too coherent, too modern. "You're certain about the dating?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral, my gaze still fixed on the bone. The archaeologist above me cleared her throat. Radiocarbon dating on a couple of samples from the teeth and a rib fragment came back consistent with our initial assessment. Plus, the stratigraphy, the lack of modern artifacts, everything points to an ancient event. I grunted, a non-committal sound. Stratigraphy was a powerful tool, but it could be manipulated. And radiocarbon dating, while robust, wasn't infallible, especially if the samples had been carefully chosen or worse, planted. My mind began to race, piecing together possibilities that were far more unsettling than an ancient tribal conflict. If these remains weren't ancient, then what was this elaborate charade? And why? "I need to take some samples," I announced, standing up slowly, my gaze sweeping over the entire pit again. The archaeologist looked surprised. "More radiocarbon, certainly. Also bone fragments for structural analysis, trace evidence from the soil around these specific fractures. Tissue samples for DNA. DNA? She questioned, a hint of skepticism in her voice. From 3,000-year-old remains. It's a long shot, not impossible with advanced techniques, I countered, already reaching for my sterile collection tools. And the trace evidence. I want to see if those flecks are what I think they are. I didn't elaborate. No need to cause a panic yet, not until I had something concrete. The tension in the pit was now palpable, no longer just the heat. The archaeologists exchanged uneasy glances. They had a story they believed, a narrative of ancient tragedy. My presence, my questions, were already starting to unravel it. I worked methodically, carefully extracting a small section of the fractured femur, a sliver of rib, and several soil samples from specific points around the remains. Each piece was meticulously catalogued, placed in individual sterile containers, and sealed. My hands, usually steady and precise, felt a slight tremor. This wasn't just a routine recovery. This was the beginning of something far more complex, far more dangerous. These need to be handled with extreme care, I told my assistant, a quiet young man who usually worked with me in the lab but had accompanied me on this trip. Directly to the processing facility, and make sure the DNA samples go straight to the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility. Tell them it's urgent, and I want the full battery of tests. I'm looking for anything that deviates from an ancient profile, anything that suggests a modern contaminant, or more importantly, a modern origin. He nodded, his eyes wide, understanding the gravity in my tone. The ancient massacre was a smokescreen. I was increasingly sure of it. My life, I knew, had just taken a very unexpected and potentially very perilous turn. The hum of the sequencers was a low, constant lullaby in the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility, stark contrast to the dust and silence of the dig site. The air here was cool, filtered, carrying the faint, metallic tang of ozone and disinfectant. I moved through the labyrinth of gleaming machines and busy technicians, a heavy plastic cooler clutched in one hand, my mind still replaying the grim tableau from the desert. The ancient massacre was a story, a narrative neatly packaged and presented, but my gut told me it was a fabrication. I needed data, cold, hard facts, to prove it. I found an empty workstation in the genetics section, a familiar space with its sterile surfaces and high-resolution monitors. The lab director, a man I'd known for years, gave me a brief nod from across the room, already absorbed in his own project. I appreciated the silent understanding. He knew when I was in the zone. Carefully, I unpacked the samples. Tiny fragments of bone, no larger than a thumbnail. Clumps of soil, meticulously scraped from around the remains. A few threads of what looked like deteriorated fabric, almost indistinguishable from the earth itself. Each piece was precious, a potential key. My hands, usually steady, felt a slight tremor as I placed the first bone fragment under the microscope, beginning the long, delicate process of extraction. Hours blurred into a methodical rhythm of grinding, centrifuging, and pipetting. My focus narrowed to the microscopic world unfolding before me. I extracted mitochondrial DNA first, hoping to establish a baseline. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited maternally, degrades at a predictable rate. Ancient samples, especially those exposed to the elements, should show significant degradation and fragmentation. The first readouts began to appear on the screen, a cascade of fluorescent peaks and valleys representing nucleotide sequences. I leaned closer, my breath hitching slightly. The initial data wasn't what I expected for remains supposedly centuries old. The sequences were remarkably intact, far too complete for the reported age and burial conditions. It was like finding a perfectly preserved letter from the 16th century, complete with crisp paper and legible ink, when all logic dictated it should be crumbling parchment. That's unusual, I murmured to myself, leaning back. My internal alarm bells began to clang. I ran the analysis again, double-checking the parameters, ensuring no contamination from my own DNA or the lab environment. The results were identical. The degradation patterns simply didn't align with the supposed timeline. This wasn't ancient, not by a long shot. Next, I focused on trace elements and isotopic analysis. I sent samples of bone and teeth to the mass spectrometry unit, requesting a full profile. The initial report came back quickly, flashing green on my screen. My eyes scanned the data, searching for specific markers. The carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bone fragments suggested a diet far richer in processed foods than would have been available to an ancient civilization. And then there were the oxygen isotopes, indicating a geographic origin inconsistent with the regional historical populations. This wasn't just a mismatch, it was a fundamental contradiction. My gaze drifted to the other, even smaller samples, the soil clumps. I placed a tiny pinch under a high-powered microscope, looking for pollen. Ancient soil should hold a specific botanical signature. Alongside the expected desert flora, there were pollen grains from non-native, cultivated species, plants introduced to the region in the last few decades, not centuries. And then, a glint. A microscopic shard of plastic embedded in one of the soil samples. Not a natural inclusion. This wasn't an ancient massacre. It was a recent crime, elaborately staged. The perpetrators had gone to incredible lengths to create a convincing facade, but they hadn't accounted for the relentless precision of modern forensic science. Everything all right, Omar? I nearly jumped, spinning around to find the lab director standing behind me, a half-eaten granola bar in his hand. His expression was one of polite inquiry, but I could feel the underlying expectation. He likely assumed I was just confirming the archaeological findings. "No, actually," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Not really. These samples, they're not adding up." He raised an eyebrow, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Not adding up how? Contamination?" "No," I insisted, gesturing to the screen. "The mitochondrial DNA is too well preserved. The isotopic signatures point to a modern diet and an origin that doesn't fit the historical record of the region. And I found modern pollen, even a shard of plastic, in the soil samples." The lab director's brow furrowed deeper. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the data on my monitor. He was a meticulous scientist, but I sensed a reluctance in his posture, a subtle shift in his demeanor. "Plastic," he said slowly, his voice laced with skepticism. "You sure it's not a lab contaminant, or something blown in by the wind at the site, perhaps during the excavation?" "I've cross-referenced every potential contaminant," I countered, my resolve hardening. And the plastic shard was embedded in a soil sample taken from directly beneath one of the remains. It's not surface debris. The preservation of the DNA, the isotopes, it's all too clean, too modern for something supposedly buried for centuries. He let out a sigh, running a hand over his thinning hair. "Omar, I understand your thoroughness, but the archaeologists are quite certain of their dating. We're talking about an ancient civilization here. What you're suggesting, it's a monumental claim. It would mean a deliberate, incredibly sophisticated hoax." "It would," I agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "But the evidence is pointing that way. I'm not making a claim, I'm reading the data. And the data says these remains are not ancient." His eyes held mine for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, concern, perhaps, or frustration. "Rerun everything, Omar, every single test. Be absolutely certain. Because if you're right, this isn't just a misdating. This is something far more troublesome." I nodded, my jaw tight. He understood the implications, even if he was hesitant to embrace them. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. I was no longer just solving a puzzle. I was dismantling a carefully constructed deception, and I had a feeling the people behind it wouldn't take kindly to having their work exposed. My hands, once trembling with anticipation, now held a steady, determined grip on the edge of the workstation. The truth, however inconvenient or dangerous, was there, waiting to be unearthed, and I was going to unearth it. The drive from the dig site to the city felt longer than it was, each mile a winding thread pulling me further from the ancient dust and closer to a truth I suspected was far more sinister. The detective's words from earlier, his hesitant acceptance of my theory, echoed in my mind. He'd seen the subtle discrepancies, the things that didn't quite fit the narrative of an ancient massacre, but the full weight of it hadn't settled on him yet. For me, it was already a lead weight in my gut. My initial observations at the site, the unusual preservation, the specific type of trauma that felt too precise for ancient weaponry, the almost deliberate arrangement of some of the remains, had screamed anachronism. Now, I needed proof, something concrete that would yank this case out of the realm of archaeology and plant it firmly in the present day. I pulled into the parking lot of the State Crime Lab, a squat, utilitarian building that hummed with the quiet industry of forensic science. The air inside, once I'd navigated the security checkpoints, was a sterile blend of cleaning agents and ozone, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the dig. I followed the familiar signs, my boots squeaking faintly on the polished linoleum, until I reached the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility. Inside, the room was a symphony of soft whirs and clicks. Banks of machines, their indicator lights glowing a steady green or amber, lined the walls, each one a silent sentinel guarding genetic secrets. A lab technician, a woman with sharp eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses and hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked up from a microscope as I entered. "Omar," he greeted, his voice calm, almost detached. "Good to see you. Your samples are ready." "Any preliminary insights?" I asked, trying to keep my own voice even. My hands felt a little damp. It was the moment of truth. She gestured to a monitor displaying a complex chromatogram, a riot of colorful peaks and valleys. "We fast-tracked them, as requested. The bone fragments, specifically. The mitochondrial DNA extraction was surprisingly robust, given their supposed age." She paused, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Too robust, actually. That was our first flag." I moved closer, my eyes scanning the data, my mind already racing ahead. "Degradation markers. Minimal," she confirmed, scrolling down to another section of the report. "Far, far less than what we'd expect from remains dating back millennia. Even in ideal preservation conditions, the cellular structure should show significant breakdown. These are remarkably intact, almost too intact." My gaze sharpened, locking onto a specific sequence. "And this," I pointed to a distinct pattern. "That's the kicker," the technician said, a hint of professional excitement finally breaking through her stoicism. We ran a broad-spectrum comparison. The genetic markers present in these samples show a strong affinity with modern populations. Not just generally human, but specifically a cluster of alleles commonly found in the regional demographic of the last century or two. There's no genetic drift consistent with ancient isolation, no unique markers that would place them outside of contemporary lineages. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my arms. This wasn't just a deviation, it was a complete contradiction. "So, these aren't ancient," I stated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Not even close." He shook his head slowly. "Based on the DNA analysis, Omar, these individuals could have died within the last 50 to 100 years, possibly even more recently. The degradation profile, the mitochondrial integrity, the genetic markers, everything points to a modern origin. Someone went to incredible lengths to make them look ancient." The hum of the machines in the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility suddenly seemed to intensify, pressing in on me. My initial suspicion had been a tiny tremor. This was an earthquake, a meticulously crafted deception, not just a simple mistake or misidentification. Someone hadn't just buried these people. They had planted them, carefully arranging them to tell a false story, a historical lie. "We also found traces of a specific type of embalming agent," she added, almost as an afterthought, pulling up another report. "Not a traditional one. A complex chemical compound designed for rapid tissue degradation, control, rather than preservation. It would slow the natural decay, giving the impression of extreme age over a shorter period, especially when combined with a specific burial environment." My jaw clenched. Embalming agent. That explained the unusual preservation I'd noted. It wasn't natural, it was engineered. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a stage play, a macabre tableau designed to mislead. "This changes everything," I murmured, more to myself than to her. The implications were enormous. This wasn't an archaeological curiosity anymore. This was a modern crime, a mass murder, disguised with an almost unimaginable level of sophistication and resources. "I imagine it does," the technician replied, his expression now serious, understanding the gravity of his findings. "Do you need anything else from us, Omar? Full sequencing, perhaps?" "Not yet," I replied, my mind already shifting gears, away from the lab and back to the dig site, to the earth that had so cleverly concealed its modern secrets. Keep these results under wraps for now. Absolute discretion. Do not share this with anyone outside of our direct chain of command, not even the local authorities until I say so. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine, acknowledging the unspoken danger. Understood. I felt the weight of it then, the true burden of what I'd unearthed. I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for enemies, powerful ones, capable of orchestrating such an elaborate charade, people who would kill to keep their secrets buried. The careful, almost gentle work of an anthropologist had just become a dangerous hunt. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the people behind this deception wouldn't hesitate to bury me right alongside their victims if I got too close to the truth. The sterile air of the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility hummed with a low, constant thrum, a sound I'd come to associate with the quiet revelation of truth. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unwavering glow on the rows of gleaming machines, their screens displaying an intricate dance of genetic code. I leaned closer to my monitor, my eyes scanning the latest sequence results from the bone samples. The preliminary reports had already confirmed my suspicions, but I needed the definitive, undeniable proof. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing markers, aligning sequences. Each line of data was a whisper from the past, but not the ancient past I'd initially been led to believe. There it was, bold and unmistakable, a specific mitochondrial haplogroup common in modern European populations, virtually non-existent in the ancient Near East. And then, the clincher, a series of epigenetic markers, indicators of lifestyle and environmental factors that simply didn't exist in the historical period the dig site was supposed to represent. This wasn't just recent, it was very recent. The kind of recent that would have living relatives. A cold dread settled in my stomach, a familiar companion these past few days. The careful, almost gentle work of an anthropologist had morphed into something far more dangerous. I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for enemies. Powerful ones, capable of orchestrating such an elaborate charade, people who would kill to keep their secrets buried. Everything all right, Omar. I nearly jumped, my head snapping up. A colleague, the senior lab technician, stood beside my workstation, a half-eaten granola bar in his hand. His gaze drifted to my screen, lingering for a moment on the complex data. Just, conclusive, I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. These samples are definitely not ancient, not even close. The technician's smile faltered. Right, well, the director just called. He wants you to reevaluate your methodology, said there might be some contamination issues. My jaw tightened. Contamination, the oldest trick in the book. There's no contamination. I ran the controls, triplicated everything. I gestured to the pristine data. This is clean, and it's damning. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. Look, Omar, I'm just relaying the message. He also mentioned that the archaeological team leader is making a formal complaint about your unorthodox methods, said you were disrupting the site. Unorthodox, I scoffed. My methods are forensic. They're revealing a modern crime, not an ancient burial. My voice was rising, and I consciously reined it in. They want to bury this, don't they? The technician just shrugged, his face a mask of practiced indifference. I don't know anything about that. Just be careful. Things are getting complicated. He walked away, leaving me alone with the humming machines and the undeniable truth on my screen. I leaned back, running a hand over my scalp. This wasn't just bureaucratic pushback. It was a warning. The mention of the director, the flimsy excuse of contamination, the complaint from the archaeological team leader, it was all too coordinated. They were trying to discredit me, to sideline me before I could make my findings public. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. Dr. Omar, a smooth, unfamiliar voice asked. It wasn't accusatory. It carried an undeniable edge of authority. I understand you've been making some perhaps you should consider a different interpretation, one that aligns more closely with the established historical narrative. I don't interpret facts to fit a narrative. I sharp back. I follow the evidence. There was a brief pause, then a soft chuckle. A commendable principle, Dr. Omar, but sometimes evidence can be misleading, and pursuing certain lines of inquiry can be. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a thinly veiled threat. This wasn't just someone trying to cover up a misidentified dig site. It would be a shame for your career, or indeed your future, to be cut short by a simple misunderstanding. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the screen still showing the disconnected call. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a surge of defiant anger. They thought they could scare me off. They thought I would back down. I looked back at the DNA sequences, the undeniable proof of a modern atrocity, cleverly hidden beneath centuries of dust and deception. This wasn't just about a scientific discovery anymore. It was personal. They had shown their hand, and in doing so, they had just given me another reason to dig deeper. I wasn't just looking for enemies, I had found them. And now I knew they were looking for me. The cover-up had begun, and I was squarely in its crosshairs. Is that a threat? My voice was level, a deliberate counterpoint to the surge of adrenaline that had just hit me. My colleague, the one who'd been so keen to dismiss my findings, just smiled, a thin, humorless line on his face. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a slow step towards me, his hand slipping into the pocket of his field jacket. My gaze flickered, not towards his hand, but towards the small, zippered cooler bag I'd placed carefully on the edge of the excavation pit, the one containing the precious bone samples, the teeth, the hair, the real evidence. They weren't just samples, they were my lifeline and potentially the key to understanding what truly happened here. Just a friendly suggestion, Omar, he answered, the words dripping with something far from friendly. His eyes, though, were what truly unsettled me. They held a cold, predatory glint I hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about professional disagreement anymore. This was personal, and it was dangerous. I didn't wait for him to finish whatever he was about to do. My own hand darted out, not towards him, but past him, snatching the cooler bag. The weight of it in my grip was reassuring, a tangible link to the truth. As I spun away, his hand finally emerged from his pocket, something metallic glinting, a small but effective taser. The air crackled with the almost inaudible hum of its charge. I didn't look back. My legs pumped, scrambling up the loose soil of the pit. My boots found purchase, sending pebbles scattering. I heard a shouted command behind me, then the rapid thud of footsteps. They were coming, plural, so he wasn't alone. That explained the sudden bravado. The dig site, usually a hive of meticulous activity, was eerily quiet at this hour, most of the crew having already retreated to their tents or the nearby temporary shelters. My car, a rental SUV, was parked a good 200 meters away near the makeshift access road. It felt like a marathon. My lungs burned, and the cooler bag, light as it was, swung with an awkward momentum. I glanced over my shoulder. Two figures were silhouetted against the dimming twilight, gaining on me. The primary colleague, and another, larger man I hadn't seen before, moving with an unsettling speed. They weren't just chasing, they were hunting. I burst through a cluster of thorny bushes, a few sharp pricks stinging my arms, but I barely registered them. The taste of dust and adrenaline filled my mouth. My mind raced, sifting through options. Confrontation was not one of them. My strength was in analysis, not brawling. My priority was the evidence, and getting to a place where I could process it, where I could be safe. Reaching the SUV, I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking only slightly. The click of the central locking was a small victory. I yanked the door open, tossed the cooler bag onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. The engine roared to life on the first turn of the key, a sweet, mechanical symphony. As I jammed the gear into reverse, I saw them. They were almost at the edge of the road, shouting now, their voices muffled by the closed windows. The larger man raised something. A rock, a bat. I didn't wait to find out. I stomped on the accelerator, gravel spitting from under the tires as I spun the SUV around, heading for the main track. The drive away from the archaeological site was a blur. The dirt road was treacherous, full of potholes and loose stones, but I pushed the vehicle, my eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. No headlights appeared behind me. For now, I was clear. My mind, however, was anything but clear. The casual threat, the taser, the pursuit, it was all too much. This wasn't just about covering up a misidentification. It was about silencing me. The bones, the carefully placed artifacts, the recent bullet fragments. They pointed to something heinous, something someone was willing to kill to keep buried. I drove for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only 40 minutes, before I finally hit the paved highway. The tension in my shoulders began to ease marginally, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. I needed to get these samples processed, and I needed to do it somewhere secure, somewhere with a chain of custody that couldn't be easily compromised. There was only one place that fit the bill: the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility. It was a fortress of scientific integrity, or so I hoped. The city lights, when they finally appeared on the horizon, were a welcome sight, a beacon of civilization after the desolate, threatening landscape of the dig site. Paranoia was a new passenger, riding shotgun. Pulling into the secure parking garage of the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility, the heavy concrete structure felt like a sanctuary. I parked in a visitor spot, but instead of heading for the main entrance, I made a detour. I knew the night shift supervisor, a meticulous woman named Dr. Anya Sharma. More importantly, I knew the protocol for urgent, off-the-books evidence submission. I bypassed the main lobby and headed for the loading dock, where a single security guard was engrossed in a paperback. He looked up, startled, as I approached. "Omar," I responded, my voice a little rougher than I intended. "I need to speak to Dr. Sharma, urgently." My disheveled appearance, the thorns still clinging to my jacket, probably told their own story. He nodded, picked up his internal phone, and made a quick call. A few minutes later, Dr. Sharma appeared, her brow furrowed with concern. He was a woman who lived by protocols, and my unscheduled, disheveled arrival clearly signaled a breach of the norm. "Omar, what on earth?" She started, but I cut her off, my voice low and urgent. "Anya, I need my help. I have samples from the archaeological dig. They're not what they seem. In fact, they're very recent, and I think someone tried to kill me to stop me from bringing them here." Her eyes widened, her professional composure momentarily cracking. "Kill I?" "Yes," I confirmed, pushing the cooler bag towards her. "These need to be secured immediately, and I need to access a sequencing station tonight if possible. There's something in these bones, something I suspect will tell us exactly how recent this ancient massacre truly is." She took the bag, her expression grim. "Follow me," she added, her voice now crisp and decisive. "We'll get these into the system, and then I can tell me everything. But first," she paused, her gaze fixed on the cooler bag, "tell me what I suspect is truly hidden in those samples." I took a deep breath, the sterile air of the lab filling my lungs. I found trace elements of modern dental composites in one of the molars, and a fragment of what looks like titanium alloy in a femur. But the real kicker, Anya, the real anomaly, wasn't just the age. It was the genetic material. I did a quick field test, just enough to confirm my suspicions. "And?" she prompted, her eyes locked on mine, waiting. "The DNA," I answered, the words feeling heavy. "It's not ancient. It's too well preserved. More importantly, there's a specific haplogroup that's incredibly rare, almost unique, to a very small, isolated population. A population that, ironically, has been the subject of several recent high-profile disappearances in the region. This isn't just a massacre, Anya." Dr. Sharma's face was a mask of shock, then understanding, then a fierce determination. We weren't just looking at bones anymore. We were looking at a crime that spanned centuries, or at least tried to. The silence in the brightly lit corridor of the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility was profound, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. "Doctor," the implications of my words hung in the air, a chilling revelation that had now settled, heavy and cold, between us. "I was right, Omar," the DNA specialist finally said, his voice a low murmur, barely audible over the sterile whir. She gestured for me to follow her back into the climate-controlled lab, a room filled with blinking lights and intricate glass tubes. On a large monitor, complex genetic sequences scrolled endlessly, a silent language of life and death. The preliminary sequencing. It's not ancient human DNA, not even close. These profiles are modern, within the last 10 years at most. A knot tightened in my gut, I'd suspected it, felt it in the very marrow of those bones, but hearing the definitive confirmation from the most precise science available was different. It solidified the horrifying truth. We weren't dealing with an ancient massacre. We were dealing with a very recent, very clever, and very brutal one. "Have I cross-referenced with any databases?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the glowing screen. My mind was already racing, piecing together the timeline, the motive, the sheer audacity of such a deception. The DNA specialist nodded, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "That's where it gets even more disturbing. We have partial matches. 2 of the individuals. Their profiles show up in missing persons registries. One from the northern coast, vanished 6 years ago. Another from the industrial heartland, reported missing 3 years back. 2 more are partial matches to distant relatives in the system, suggesting they're likely also missing persons, just not direct matches in the database yet. They are from different regions, Omar, different lives, no obvious connection." My jaw clenched. Different regions, different timelines. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was a pattern, a meticulous collection of individuals. They were brought together then. I mused aloud, the word brought tasting like ash, and then buried together. "It certainly appears that way," she confirmed, her expression grim. "This isn't a coincidence, it's deliberate." I thanked her, my mind already pivoting. The DNA had given us when, and the beginnings of who. Now, the bones themselves had to tell me how. I needed to get back to my lab, to the physical remains that held the silent screams of these individuals. Within the hour, I was hunched over my workbench in the forensic anthropology lab, the sterile white lights reflecting off the array of skeletal fragments laid out before me. The air was thick with the faint, earthy scent of the excavated material, now mingled with the tang of cleaning agents. Surgical tools, fine brushes, dental picks, calipers, and magnifying lenses lay neatly arranged. I donned my gloves, the thin latex a second skin, and began my meticulous re-examination. I started with the skull I'd initially flagged. The DNA results had confirmed my suspicions about its modernity, but the bone itself held more secrets. I gently cleaned away the last vestiges of earth from the occipital region, tracing a hairline fracture that had been partially obscured. Under the stereomicroscope, the edges of the fracture were sharp, consistent with perimortem trauma injury sustained around the time of death. This wasn't some ancient break, smoothed by millennia. This was fresh. Then I saw it. Just above the fracture, barely visible to the naked eye, was a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration, a subtle alteration in the bone's surface texture. I carefully scraped a microscopic sample and placed it on a slide. Later, a colleague from the trace evidence unit would confirm my suspicion. Traces of a powerful oxidizing agent. Something designed to accelerate degradation, to mimic the effects of extreme age. And it wasn't just on this skull. As I moved from one skeletal element to another, I found similar subtle signs on the ribs, the vertebrae, even the long bones. A deliberate chemical treatment of the remains. I moved to another individual, a partial skeleton that had initially appeared to be a young adult male. The DNA confirmed male, likely in his early 20s. His cranium showed a different type of trauma, a neat, circular defect, characteristic of a high-velocity projectile. Not an arrow, as the archaeological team had first thought, but a bullet. The entry wound was precise, located just behind the ear, and there was no corresponding exit wound, suggesting the projectile was either still lodged within the skull or had been meticulously removed. No defensive wounds on the arms or hands, no signs of struggle. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Each individual bore signs of a swift, decisive end. Blunt force trauma to the cranium, a single projectile wound, or sharp force injuries to the neck or chest, all consistent with professional, targeted killings. There was a lack of widespread trauma, no frenzied hacking or multiple, overlapping injuries. These weren't victims of a chaotic battle. They were victims of calculated, efficient murder. The chemical treatment, the varied origins of the victims, the precise execution-style injuries, the deliberate burial designed to mimic antiquity, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying picture. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase these people, not just from the present, but from any historical record, by burying them in the deepest past. I leaned back, pulling off my gloves. The bones, once silent witnesses to an ancient past, were now screaming a modern horror. They were telling me about a sophisticated criminal enterprise, one that didn't just kill, but meticulously crafted an entire false narrative around its victims. And the more I listened to their silent voices, the more I realized I was peeling back layers of a conspiracy far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The sterile hum of the machines in the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility was a familiar lullaby, a backdrop to the silent symphony of genetic information unfolding on my screen. I'd been here for hours, the results from the advanced sequencing filtering in, line by painstaking line. The lab technician, a quiet woman with perpetually tired eyes, had long since left, leaving me alone with the glowing monitors and the weight of what they revealed. The initial mitochondrial DNA sequencing had been swift, confirming the distinct, unrelated lineages among the individuals. No ancient family group, no tribal massacre. My gut feeling had been right. This wasn't some forgotten historical tragedy, but the Y chromosome and autosomal DNA. That's where the true story began to unfurl, tying disparate threads into a chilling knot. I leaned closer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to cross-reference. The data wasn't just telling me who these people weren't, it was screaming who they were. 3 of the individuals, 2 adults and a juvenile, shared remarkably close genetic markers. Siblings, a parent and 2 children, a family unit. And then, the match. Not a direct match to a living person in any law enforcement database, but a clear, undeniable familial link. A very specific, very prominent surname started to form in my mind, a name synonymous with power and wealth in this region for generations. A sharp jolt went through me, not a cliché, but a sudden, physical tightening in my chest. I sat back, the fluorescent lights of the lab suddenly too bright, too harsh. I thought back to the dig site, the carefully placed artifacts, the faux historical context. It was all a theatrical production, a macabre play to hide a far more modern atrocity. The sophisticated crime I'd suspected wasn't just sophisticated in its execution, it was audacious in its deception. The DNA didn't just point to a family, it pointed to the family. The one that owned vast swaths of land, the one with political sway, the one whose historical narratives were meticulously curated and fiercely protected. The victims, this small family unit, were a branch of that very lineage, a branch that perhaps had been inconvenient, a branch that knew too much or stood in the way of something significant. I pulled up the geological survey data from the dig site again, cross-referencing it with historical land deeds I'd requested the detective to send over. The original archaeological dig was on land that had been in the powerful family's possession for centuries. But a specific section, the very section where the mass grave was found, had been subject to a bitter, protracted land dispute a few decades ago, involving a smaller, less influential branch of the family. The very branch whose DNA now stared back at me from the screen. The pieces slammed together with an audible click in my mind. Their ancient massacre was a brilliant, horrifying smokescreen. These people weren't victims of an ancient conflict, they were silenced. Their deaths, the DNA was confirming, occurred within the last 30 to 40 years. The cellular degradation rates, the specific isotopes in their bones, all pointed away from millennia and towards decades. They had been killed, then cleverly interred within an existing archaeological site, their bodies dressed with a veneer of antiquity, using the ongoing dig as the perfect, unquestioned cover. The motive crystallized. Land, legacy, the silencing of inconvenient truths. The smaller family branch must have held information, a claim, or a secret that threatened the larger, dominant lineage. To make them disappear was one thing, but to make them disappear into a historical context, to literally bury their modern demise under the weight of ancient history, that was the work of a true mastermind, someone who could orchestrate a cover-up on an archaeological scale. I thought of the subtle anomalies I'd observed. The lack of consistent trauma patterns for a battle, the specific modern tool marks, the strangely preserved organic material. All of it now made terrifying sense. The mastermind wasn't just burying bodies. They were burying a crime, ensuring that if the bodies were ever found, they would be immediately dismissed as historical, uninvestigible. My gaze drifted to the other DNA profiles, the ones that didn't match the victim family. They were distinct, isolated. They were collateral damage, witnesses. The air in the lab felt suddenly heavy, pressing in. I wasn't just a forensic anthropologist anymore. I was a detective, unraveling a decades-old murder plot that reached into the highest echelons of local power. It was someone respected, someone powerful, someone who had built an empire on a foundation of lies and blood. And I, Omar, had just started digging at the very corner of that foundation. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore. It was immediate, palpable, and breathing down my neck. The lab technicians had long since departed, leaving me alone with the quiet whirring and the glowing monitors, bathed in their cool blue light. My coffee, long cold, sat forgotten beside the keyboard, a testament to my singular focus. My eyes scanned the latest output, a complex tapestry of genetic markers. My initial hypothesis, the one that had nagged at me since I first touched those bones, was solidifying into an undeniable truth. The bone samples, carefully excavated and meticulously prepared, were telling a story that defied the archaeological narrative. The mitochondrial DNA, in particular, was screaming at me. Instead of the expected ancient haplogroups, consistent with the supposed historical period of the site, I was seeing patterns that were distinctly modern. Not just modern, but prevalent in specific populations known to inhabit the region today, not thousands of years ago. It was like finding a smartphone in a Roman tomb. Then came the nuclear DNA results, cross-referencing against a national database. My breath hitched. A partial match. Not a full one, but enough to trigger a flag. The system highlighted a missing persons case from 5 years prior. A young woman reported missing from a town less than 100 miles from the dig site. Her parents had submitted their DNA years ago, a desperate attempt to find her. The familial match, though incomplete due to the degradation of the samples, was chillingly strong. It wasn't just a modern crime. It was this modern crime. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The pristine condition of some of the skeletal remains, the lack of typical ancient burial markers, the unusual soil composition, the carefully placed ancient artifacts that seemed almost too perfect. It wasn't an ancient massacre at all. It was a recent atrocity, meticulously staged to look like something else entirely. These powerful figures weren't just burying a truth. They were burying people, then burying that truth under layers of expertly crafted deception. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction, quickly followed by a prickle of alarm. This wasn't just academic anymore. This was dangerous. I had the evidence, the undeniable proof, but what good was it if it never saw the light of day? I needed to secure this data, disseminate it, and do it fast. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a secure backup to an encrypted external drive. Simultaneously, I drafted an email to the lead detective on the case, attaching the preliminary report and the cross-referenced DNA results, setting a timer for it to send in 10 minutes. A safety net. Just as the progress bar for the backup crawled past 80%, a soft click echoed from the door behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. The lab was supposed to be empty. "Working late, Omar." The voice was smooth, almost silken, devoid of any genuine warmth. I turned slowly, my muscles tensing. Standing in the doorway was a man I'd only seen once before, at the initial briefing at the dig site, the lead financier, a man of considerable influence and even more considerable wealth, whose name had been mentioned in hushed tones by the archaeologists. He was impeccably dressed, even at this hour, his suit tailored to perfection, his silver hair neatly combed. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just tying up some loose ends," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline now coursing through me. I kept my body angled, subtly blocking the view of the screen, though I doubted it mattered. He likely knew exactly what I was looking at. He stepped further into the facility, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. Loose ends can be problematic, wouldn't you agree? Especially when they unravel an entire tapestry. He gestured vaguely towards the screens. Assume you found something rather definitive. My grip tightened on the mouse. I have. The remains are not ancient, they're recent, and one of them matches a missing person's profile. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened, glinting like polished steel. A regrettable error in archaeological dating, perhaps. These things happen. The carbon dating can be unreliable. Not this unreliable, I countered, my voice firm. And carbon dating wasn't the only method. The DNA speaks for itself. It's conclusive. This wasn't an ancient burial site, it was a dumping ground, and it was covered up very cleverly by someone with significant resources. I watched him, trying to gauge his next move. The backup was at 95%. Significant resources can also smooth over unfortunate misunderstandings, he responded, his voice dropping slightly, a predatory purr. He pulled a slim, black leather wallet from his inner jacket pocket and extracted a card, sliding it across a nearby workstation towards me. It was a Swiss bank account number. A significant sum could be arranged, Omar, enough to ensure you never have to work another late night again. A quiet retirement, a new life anywhere you choose. I looked at the card, then back at him. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. You think I can be bought? He chuckled. A low, humorless sound. Everyone has a price, Omar. Some just need a little more convincing than others, or perhaps a little less. Incentive to be uncooperative. His gaze flickered to the door, then back to me, a silent threat. The backup completed. The external drive glowed green. These people deserve justice. His face finally dropped the pretense of a smile. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken menace. Justice is a luxury, Omar, often dictated by those with the power to define it. It needs to disappear. And I with it if I insist on being so, principled. Too late, I added, meeting his gaze head-on. A faint ping sounded from my computer, the email confirmation. The truth is already out. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something akin to panic in his eyes, quickly masked by a surge of furious anger. He lunged, not for me, but for the external drive. But I was ready. I snatched the drive, pulling it back just as his hand swiped empty air. Before he could react further, the heavy lab door burst open. Omar, are I all right? It was the lead detective, his face grim, his hand already on the service weapon holstered at his hip. Behind him stood two uniformed officers, their expressions equally stern. The timed email had worked. The truth, in all its ugly detail, was finally exposed. The heavy oak door to the office swung inward with a sharp crack, startling both of us. The lead detective, his expression grim and impatient, stood framed in the doorway, his eyes sweeping from my hand, clutching the external drive to the colleague's contorted face. Everything all right in here, Omar? The detective asked, his voice low but laced with an unmistakable warning. He hadn't waited for an answer. His gaze had already settled on the colleague, who now stood frozen, a veneer of strained civility replacing his earlier fury. The detective's presence was a cold shower, dousing the immediate threat, but leaving the air thick with unspoken animosity. I didn't waste a second. Perfectly fine, detective, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor still running through my arm. I held up the external drive, just securing the last piece of the puzzle. I believe this contains the missing data we need to confirm our suspicions. The colleague shot me a look that promised retribution, but he said nothing. He knew the game was up, at least for now. The detective simply nodded, his eyes lingering on the drive for a moment before shifting back to the colleague. I think it's time you came with me, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And just like that, the immediate danger passed. The colleague, his shoulders slumped in defeat, was escorted out, leaving me alone in the suddenly quiet office, the faint scent of old dust and stale coffee hanging in the air. I clutched the drive, my grip tight, feeling the weight of not just the small device, but of the truth it held. The truth that had nearly cost me everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 2 days later, the sterile hum of machinery was the only sound in the State Crime Lab DNA sequencing facility. The air was cool, carrying the faint, metallic tang of reagents. Fluorescent lights cast a stark, shadowless glow on the polished surfaces and complex equipment. Beside me, a lab technician, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, tapped a few keys, bringing up a side-by-side comparison. "The matches are undeniable, Omar," he stated, his voice hushed, almost reverent. She pointed a slender finger at a highlighted sequence. "This sample, extracted from the bone fragments you brought in from Sector D, the ones we initially thought were ancient, it's a perfect match for the profile on the external drive." The confirmation was still a punch to the gut. The victim was not some nameless figure from a forgotten past. This was a modern person, meticulously hidden, their identity now screaming from the digital readouts. The drive hadn't just contained the victim's DNA. It held the genetic fingerprints of the perpetrators, a digital ledger of their involvement. She navigated to another screen, displaying multiple columns. "We've cross-referenced them with the national database. The primary profile matches a known individual, a prominent figure with significant political connections. The secondary profiles, accomplices likely, all high-ranking. The powerful figures I had suspected. They hadn't just orchestrated a murder. They had attempted to erase it from existence, to bury it under centuries of earth and the guise of historical tragedy. The colleague's desperation to keep me away, his frantic lunge for the drive, made sickening sense now. He was part of it, or at least complicit in the cover-up. My eyes scanned the intricate patterns on the screen, each base pair a silent testament to a life taken, a truth distorted. The sheer audacity of it, using the very tools of history to obscure a contemporary crime, was staggering. They had underestimated the resilience of truth, the relentless march of scientific inquiry. So, the narrative of an ancient ritual sacrifice. I began, letting the words hang in the air. The technician shook her head, a grim line to her mouth. Completely fabricated. The trauma patterns, the lack of weathering on some of the bone surfaces, the subtle signs of modern tools. It all points to a recent event. The carbon dating was deliberately tampered with, and the archaeological context was expertly manipulated to support the false narrative. It was a masterpiece of deception, a crime cloaked in academic legitimacy. But my gut, my years of sifting through the echoes of the dead, had told me otherwise. The anomalies, the tiny inconsistencies that others dismissed, were the threads that unraveled the whole gruesome tapestry. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the sun-baked trench, the carefully placed artifacts, the skeletal remains arranged with such macabre precision. It wasn't just about identifying a victim, it was about exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons. "This will be enough," I said, opening my eyes and looking at the technician. Her face was pale, but there was a fierce satisfaction in her gaze. "This is the evidence we needed. Ironclad." She nodded. "Absolutely. The detective has already been notified. They're moving on it now." A wave of exhaustion washed over me, heavy and profound. Justice in this case would be a slow, arduous process, a battle fought in courtrooms and headlines. But the first, crucial step had been taken. My voice, amplified by the undeniable language of their own DNA. This was why I did what I did. Not for glory, not for accolades, but for the quiet, unyielding pursuit of what was real, what was true. But in the quiet labs, under the watchful gaze of science, some truths simply refused to stay buried. They always, eventually, found their way to the light.